Empire. Those wars were caused by the lust of the Roman Church for power and wealth, for neither then nor since have its professions and practice corresponded. While it is proclaimed as its founder, Jesus, the exemplar of peace on earth, goodwill to men, its history reeks with the blood of millions of human beings, victims or dupes who were recruited and sacrificed in projects designed to swell the power of that organization. Under pretensions of virtue and zeal for God, the blackest of lust of power and gain, her history is foul with crime. She counts on time to have it forgotten, and believes that historians will do the rest. They are capable of making some very erroneous statements for concealment. I have heard an Irish Roman Catholic priest make the statement, in a lecture on Egypt, that the Mohammedans burned the Library of Alexandria in the year 700 A.D. He did but skip 300 years in making that statement. If the truth be known, there was no library in Alexandria at that date to be destroyed. Who could believe that so intolerant and wicked a body as the Roman Church would allow a library to exist in the year 700, in an age when they were putting to death everyone known to have advanced ideas or knowledge? Hypatia, the scholar and philosopher, was put to death in the year 414 by St. Cyril and his mob, many of whom were monks. She was spreading light and knowledge and stood in the way of Bishop Cyril and the reign of ignorance, which was inaugurated by the so-called Fathers. She was seized on the steps of the academy where she delivered her lectures, stripped naked on the street, dragged into a Roman church, and put to death, her body being burned. For more than 1,000 years thereafter, it was more than anyone's life was worth to have it known that one could think for oneself. It was a long cry from Hypatia to John Huss and Galileo and the victims of the Spanish Inquisition. The Roman Church policy did not tolerate or encourage libraries any more than it tolerated the Irish Church of Iessa. A church that is spreading ignorance and suppressing knowledge is not suffering libraries to exist. This priest would falsify in order to remove the blame from his own church and place it upon another. His church committed this crime under the leadership of the zealot St. Cyril, Bishop of Alexandria, in or about the year 400. The following excerpt, taken from the writings attributed to a St. Augustine, will show how much reliability can be placed upon what they have written for us. Augustine is said to be one of the greatest of the Church Fathers. He says, quote, I was already Bishop of Hippo when I went into Ethiopia with some servants of Christ there to preach the gospel. In this country we saw many men and women without heads, who had 2 great eyes in their breasts, and in countries still more southerly we saw people who had but 1 eye in their foreheads. End quote. Quoted in Taylor's Syntagma, page 52, found in Bible Myths, page 437. A people for whom such things were written must have been grossly ignorant or reduced to a juvenile state of mind. In our day, children 10 years old would refuse to believe such stories. I have quoted this to give an idea of the mental soil in which Romanism developed and can best flourish, and this is a sample of what one of the greatest fathers of the Church wrote. This statement of Augustine's is pure falsehood, but no more so than the story given out by those same fathers as to the real source whence they obtained Jesus and the Bible, the story by which they have deceived the entire Christian world, saying that they came of the Hebrew race, a race which never existed and which was but a priestly cult or order of the early Christians of the ancient sun worship of the Irish religion of Iessa. Chapter 9. The Fiction in Roman History. It has been said that the history of ancient Rome is mostly fiction. This observation is very true, but in the absence of any special effort to expose these fictions, they have persisted through the efforts of modern churchmen and have been embodied in the history textbooks of the schools. These invented stories of events are still taught as genuine facts. This fiction is not due to our authors having merely a misunderstanding of the past, or but a partial knowledge of the events of those remote periods, but it is the result of a studied propaganda which has been carried on by Rome and Britain for centuries. The operation of this propaganda has been continued in full force because the ruling spirits of the Roman and English church hierarchies are as alive to the fact and as conscious today of the fraud perpetrated on the world, resulting in the overthrow of the Irish church and the false story of the Irish Bible and Savior, as they were at the time the fraud was first enacted. As Rome and Britain together brought about this state of affairs, they both have ever since endeavored to keep in circulation the false and absurd tales which they invented and presented to us as history. In fact, our history of Rome has come from the English hierarchy and was composed to harmonize with this idea. The internal evidence alone is sufficient to prove this, even though other evidence, no matter how wide the rift has become in politics and religion between England and Rome since the perpetration of this great crime, their joint guilt and the fear of the consequences of exposure have been the impelling motives for maintaining secrecy. The very life and existence of the English and Roman churches depended upon a truce regarding this matter. The English church prides itself as being the eldest daughter of the Roman church, and therefore an apostolic church, a claim which is as false as that of Rome itself. Both Peter and Paul, as well as the rest of the so-called apostles, are but ideas personified. They never existed as human beings and are but invented characters. The lesson taught by the manner in which the mother church, Rome, acquired the papacy was not lost on the daughter. For in due course of time and with the development of events, the idea was born in the minds of the English hierarchy that someday the English church would displace the Roman and appropriate the papacy for itself and become the ruling church of the world. Is not this the real reason why King Henry VIII was proclaimed head or pope of the English church? They were conscious of the fact that it was by force of English arms that Rome got the papacy, and they thought that the time at hand for them to reach out for it. Rome had to them as a model. It was a time when England was deeply conscious of her position and importance, and the idea was held that England was destined to be the logical successor of the Roman Empire as a world power. To this day, she has not relinquished that idea. It is an ideal which she is secretly and steadily pursuing. The English state has persisted in its endeavors to extend its dominions with the idea of dominating the world. The papacy was to be an aid to that end. They knew how Rome acquired it, for they had reduced and plundered Ireland in order to confer it upon her. Now they thought the time auspicious to appropriate it as an appendage and aid to the English crown. But this ambition was destined not to be realized. The course of events has kept the papacy at Rome. However, the British state has persevered in its efforts to extend its empire to this very day. In England, church and state work hand in hand, and my Lord Bishop still sits in the House of Lords participating in the acts of vicious government as evidenced by the recent happenings in Ireland. A certain bishop in the upper branch of Parliament defended the killing by government forces, whose deeds, said to be justified as reprisals, have been denounced by an outspoken portion of the British press as a disgrace to civilized government. The propaganda of British church and state is carried on in our own country. It is very evident in the tone of our leading newspapers. In our school histories, it is carried on in one of its phases, in the guise of fabulous events which are presented as real occurrences in the history not only of England, but also of Rome. The same can be said of the history of Greece, for the authorship is the same, and for the same purpose of deception. It is not within the scope of this work to do more than give a few succinct examples. In writing their histories of Rome and Greece, the church scribes had no intention of confining themselves to the narrative of actual facts which did happen or might have happened in the material and political development of those two countries. If they had really wished to write an accurate history of those countries at the late day in which they were composed, It would have been almost impossible to have done so. From the beginning of a certain period which those histories treat of, and for centuries later, the Roman Church was engaged in the destruction of libraries and records rather than in preserving them. All the histories written by the priests and the monks were falsely colored and intentionally fictitious. They were written to convey a secret meaning to the chosen ones. Were it not for the facts presented in these pages, it would be difficult to reconcile the action of the Church in destroying all literature and records in one age, and at a later period, manifesting such zeal in endeavors to encourage the production of literature and quote-unquote histories, and the establishment of schools in which to give instruction in those histories. Those histories were written for purposes of propaganda, which is still being carried on. The English invasion of Ireland at the behest of Rome, the suppression of the Irish papacy and Church of Iesa, with the appropriation of its Bible and Savior, and the false statements made by Rome as to the Savior's birthplace and earthly career, made it absolutely necessary for church writers to produce histories which would either substantiate the fact or make it very plausible or difficult to refute. So, therefore, they have given us an ingenious account of the past ages and blended in the fictitious stories of the birth of Jesus and how we came to have the Bible. In writing their histories, they have invented and introduced such facts as were suitable to contain certain hidden ideas and at the same time serve as a history for the multitude. Along these lines, they proceeded to reconstruct history. After the plan was thought out, the absence of real facts presented no difficulty to the writers. They invented the facts which would best serve the purpose they had in mind. These facts conform to certain mental conceptions of the writers and represent aspects of man's physical or spiritual nature, or both, as the case may be. The interpretation of the historian Buckle will explain the philosophy and lines upon which the priests of Rome and Britain built up their histories. He says, quote, "The real history of the human race is the history of tendencies which are perceived by the mind, and not of events which are discovered by the senses." End quote. Either through instruction or by intuitive penetration, Buckle became aware of the process or lines along which our histories have been written. Let us consider the mythical personage Julius Caesar, who has been introduced into Roman history by the priests in order to glorify Rome with great characters. While at first they endow him with the qualities that make him very human, they finally elevate him to the magnitude of a demigod and, at death, deify him. As a hero leading the Roman legions, he represents, like Hercules, the sun god. When he crosses the Rubicon to make himself master of Rome and seize the crown, his character changes. Here he represents the spirit or human ego of man, being born into the flesh and taking possession of the body. One of the definitions of the word Rome is body, and the Rubicon, ruby or red, represents the blood in the body. This illustrates the priestly ideals on which false history has been written. This also explains why they say that the month of July was named after Julius. It was named for him, but long ages before he became a Latin hero. The name of the month of July is taken from the Irish name of that month, which is Iúil, there being no J in the Irish alphabet. The word Iúil represents the sun in his aspect of power at that period. As the Latin is a daughter of the Celtic, the British priest scribes borrowed the name and created a new Roman hero and demigod, Julius Caesar.